Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I am answering questions. I've got a small announcement. I have a finished sewing project, an almost finished spinning project, 2 new knitting projects. A lot is going on, so let's get started. Before we get started, I wanted to answer a couple of questions that have come up in the comments recently and several times, so I thought it was worth talking about. And then just a mini announcement, which is that I just got Invisalign this week, so I might lisp a little bit more than I normally do, and you just might notice that I have these in here. My teeth had gotten crowded over the years. I had braces as a kid. I think a lot of people did, but over time they kind of moved forward and got more crowded, but they've been starting to hit each other in front and cause chipping. You can see on the screen what the simulation of what my teeth look like now versus what they're going to look like hopefully in a few months. And so I'd like to maintain my dental health for the rest of my life, so I got Invisalign. So that's a little mini announcement. The questions that I've had recently, I was telling about this roving, this Malabrigo, and it's pronounced nube, not noob, like I was pronouncing it Spanish for cloud. It's a kettle dyed merino combed top, and it's kind of compacted. Just the dyeing process. When you dye top, you might get a bit compacted. And somebody in the comments had told me that they steam their Malabrigo nube before they spin it. I had been told to kind of pre-draft it a little bit to make it so it wasn't so compacted, but the steaming thing was pretty cool. And I did that, and this is only half of it. I mean, it just got really a lot bigger. Well, I had a couple of people ask how I steamed it. They wanted to know how I steamed this. People had asked how I had steamed the yarn that I used for the sweater I'm wearing here, which had been knit into a sweater 10 years ago and was like ramen. And I mentioned people were asking how I had steamed that yarn. So I want to show you what I have that helps me. I keep it here in my office studio so that I can use it for all kinds of things. I didn't think that was going to be that big of a deal to go get this. So I just have this hand steamer. I don't know, it's a Conair. If I can figure out what it is, I'll put a link down to an Amazon link down in the description. Model GS76XGD is what it is. Who knows if it's still available. It's got a little water reservoir. You turn it on here, and then you wait for it to heat up. It's got this little light indicators, and you can reduce how much steam you want to come out. But this is what I use. So I use this to sometimes steam block swatches, especially if I'm going to use them for a video, you know, and I just want them curling up when they're on the needles, and so I might steam them. I will use this I just use these to steam some pants you're going to see a little later because they were kind of wrinkled. I'll wait for this to be ready. So it's ready now. All of these lights right here lit up, and you can switch the amount of steam that you are going to get, and then you press this button here. And pretty soon the steam starts coming out. I don't know if you can see that. You can probably hear it. And so it will sit on the desk. I just set it on my desk, and then I just ran this in front of it like that and watched it open up. And I did that for the yarn as well. I frogged it out. I wound it into hanks. I hung it like on a hook type of thing. And then I just took the steamer and wound it around. You don't have to go out and buy something to do this. This was just something that I knew I would use a lot, and I was wishing I had, because I was using other methods and it was just inconvenient for me. So you could boil a pot of water and put like a a cookie rack on top of it and steam things that way. You could take a steam iron, if you have a good steam iron where you can force the steam to come out of it when you want it to, you could use that. So there are a lot of ways that you can do this. This is the way that has just become most convenient for me. It's a tool that I use. It's like a Swift and ball winder. I have this very close to where I sit so that it's really convenient for me to use. But that's how I did the steaming. The second question that I get pretty often, particularly when it's a technique video on a particular cast-on method. And recently I did a video on knitting on, 2 different ways of doing knitting on. Just because I didn't have that in my vault of technique videos, I was kind of surprised because I was planning another video in the future about different cast-on methods and comparing them. And I was like, oh, I don't have that video. I should make that video first, and then I can refer to it later. One of the questions, or a couple of questions I got were, would this be good for socks, or can I use this in XYZ situation, or will it work if I do A, B, or C? These are questions that the person asking could answer themselves by trying it out in a project like the one that they were suggesting. Maybe it's a pair of socks. Will this work with socks? Well, is there a reason you think it wouldn't work? and so what happens if you actually cast on the number of stitches you need for a sock using this method, knitting for a few inches and then trying it on and seeing how it compares to the cast on you normally use? Then you will have the answer about whether or not you personally would want to use this cast on for socks. Because what I would do is not necessarily what you would do. And the question about can I use this in the situation almost sounds like they're asking permission, and I don't think they are. Sometimes I think it's just reassurance that their idea would work, and nobody has said explicitly that it would, and so they're just looking to find out if it's okay. Anything is okay in your own knitting. You can do whatever you want. And the best way to learn what it is that you like and what techniques work for you in which situations is for you to try them. You don't necessarily have to cast on 350 stitches using this new technique and then only to discover you hated it. Try it on a swatch. Compare it to the cast on you normally use. Look for the kind of qualities that are different in the new cast on versus what you usually use. And are there things that you like about one versus the other or dislike? And that's for you to evaluate, because a lot of knitting is just personal decisions about what it is that you like and what you want, or the problems that you're trying to overcome in your projects that maybe other people don't have. And so by swatching it out or trying it out on a project, you're going to learn a lot more. First of all, you're going to get practice with the technique. And so if it turns out you don't want it in this situation, you will remember it later on at some point when you're like, oh, this would be a good place to use this technique that I learned before. And you'll have an understanding of how it behaves, how it looks, the process to use it, all of that. A lot of people think that swatching is a waste of time or a waste of yarn, and it is neither. It's only a waste of time in yarn if you think learning is a waste of time. So if you just want to be told what to do and not spend any time figuring anything out or making decisions for yourself, then maybe it is a waste of time. But for the most part, the purpose of swatching is to learn something, is to give you information. So a gauge swatch will give you information about gauge if you are unfamiliar with that particular yarn. And you'll be able to find out, you know, what needle size you need to get gauge and whether or not you even like this yarn. That's completely different than doing swatches for the purpose of techniques and trying to understand how you might use something. And again, how you personally might want to use something, not how I might want to use something. It's a decision that you need to make, and you can make that very easily after you have learned something by doing a swatch and trying out the technique. This summer, I signed up for a pants fitting class where we would be drafting our own pattern for pants using our measurements, but also using a template to start with. So it makes the process easier than having to draft completely by hand. And the idea was that you use this template, you start with it, you make a muslin, and then the next week you come in and you do a fitting. And so I was really lucky in that I only had a couple of changes I needed to make to my, I can make it to my muslin and then transfer that to my pattern, where some people had to make a bunch of adjustments and then do a second muslin and then make a second set of adjustments. I think there's something about I don't know if you do the horizontal adjustments first and then you do the length ones. I think that's what it is. So if you had issues with a couple of different things, you'd have to make those adjustments. So I was really lucky. I only had to do changes to my existing muslin. The class was 5 weeks long, and I got to the end of the 4th class, and all I needed to do was the waistband. And we had been talking about it with my muslin. We had done some contouring in the back, like by doing a seam, because I have an issue with my pants usually where they might fit my body and then they get to, my waist, and then the waistband sticks out. Sometimes a lot, it just depends on how well they fit. And I just, that's the way pants fit. Well, what she was saying on that 4th class was that I might need an actual fully contoured waistband. So it would be a curved waistband. And then she would walk me through that in the 5th class. Well, the class met on Thursday nights from 6 to 9 p.m. and it was in St. Paul. So then, lugging all your stuff to your car and then driving home. Wouldn't get home till at least 9:30. And we were leaving for a road trip to Santa Fe the next morning at like 5 a.m. And it was just getting ready for the road trip. I was like, this is too much. So I called and I asked, is there another class I could sign up for where I could learn this information, get this? And she said, yes. So I signed up for a weekend sewing marathon. So you bring whatever projects you want to work on for that whole weekend, so you just don't have any distractions. 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., you're just working on what you want to work on. So I wanted to finish those trousers, and I wanted to draft a modification of my original pants that had kind of wide legs. I wanted them a little slimmer for a second pair. We went through and we did the contour waist. I did all of that. They fit me great. They're actually high-waisted. Most of my high-waisted pants are still, a couple inches below my actual natural waist. And it was in this color that I picked up at a sort of a warehouse fabric place here in town called S.R. Harris. It was purple twill fabric. And so it was a color I liked. I didn't know if I'd actually wear them or not, because this is really a wearable muslin is the hope for what you're going to get out of this. When I brought the pants home, I realized that I have something to wear with those pants. And that was a sweater that I knit as part of this long-term project where I was knitting a sweater from each decade from the 1890s to the 1990s. I had knit this kind of close-fitting, it was Aran weight, so it was thicker than you would expect for the 1930s. The issue with that sweater is that it ends right at my waist, and I didn't have any pants that were long enough. So if I wore them with something, I'd sit down and there'd be this big gap of skin, and so I'd have to wear like black pants with a black camisole, and I just was never comfortable wearing that sweater out of the house. And I realized, well, that sweater goes with those pants, and these are truly high-waisted pants. And so I'm going to show you, I'm going to model for you my 1930s sweater, and then these pants, which are made on out of a template, a vintage pant spinning template from the late 70s, early 80s. So it's like a real mix-up of vintage styles. But I wanted to show it to you because some of you had asked about how that pants class had gone. And it wasn't until a couple of weeks ago that I actually finished those pants. So the way that we did the waistband and figured out how to contour it to fit my body was I cut out a strip to represent the waistband and how high it was going to be. I sewed it or basted it on. And then Michelle, the teacher, pinned it. And you can see it's like doing darts, so that the waistband is narrower at the top than it is along the part where I sewed it. And so then I removed it from the pants and I laid it out on the tracing paper and I drew this outline, and then I added some seam allowance for it because this is going to be the top once the seam allowance is out. And I cut out 2 of them so that I could have a waistband like this. And so there's a seam along here. And that's how I did this contoured waistband. Now, if I needed a lower waistband, I probably won't need as much contouring, but at least I know what the process is, because every pair of pants I have ever had, you know, comes up around my rear end, and then the pants go out like the waistband, you know, it just comes out like this, out from my body. I just thought that's how pants were. And I thought maybe it had something to do with having more of a booty, or I didn't know what it was, but I just didn't realize that the waistband could be contoured like that to make it actually fit my body. And I'm thrilled to know that that's something that can be done. Because it was contoured and it was partially on the bias, and because this is a wearable muslin and I didn't bother to use interfacing for the waistband, it did stretch a bit right here at the front. And she kind of knew that when she was telling me how to lay it out, that could happen, that she was trying to decide where would that stretch end up being, like how should she have me lay it out. But if I do interfacing next time, that will prevent this kind of thing from happening. But it's really not going to be visible anyway, because I'll be wearing a shirt or a sweater or something that will cover up the waistband. Got lucky with the button at the shop. They have a bowl full of just single buttons that are just lone buttons, and I just was digging through looking for something, trying to figure out what color would go well with this. And I saw this one purple button and it was perfect. I was really happy. And I got to do a new different kind of buttonhole on my sewing machine. I did one that has the little keyhole rounded end right here, just to try it out. So it was a fun experience. I got a pair of pants that fit me, and it happens to go with a sweater that I've always had difficulty pairing with anything because it was so short in the waist. So overall, very, very happy. Last summer, I scoured a fleece I had bought at Shepherd's Harvest probably 4 years before that. And it's a fleece that I remember it drew me like a magnet. And this is when I really didn't know anything about buying fleeces, but it just pulled me in. And I always loved it, and so I finally scoured it last summer, and I still loved the wool. And so this summer, the beginning of the summer, I carded the entire fleece and realized I didn't really want to spin. I think I started spinning with it and realized I was spinning pretty fine and I didn't want to knit or spin a sweater's quantity of this so fine. And I thought, well, maybe I can spin enough for a pair of socks and then move on to another spinning project. And so that's what I did. I finished spinning up the singles. I thought I had enough, and so I plied it yesterday. When I ran out of singles on one of the spools, my bobbin was pretty full, so I wound it off, washed it, kind of finished the yarn, and weighed it, and realized there's not enough yardage here for socks. If I spin a little bit more to refill that third bobbin, I can spin off the rest of it, and then I think I will have enough. Let's go to the overhead, and then I can tell you a little bit more about this yarn that I've made. This is the wool that I started with for my yarn. I had, I don't know how many pounds of this. It's a blend, or it's not a blend, it's a sheep that was crossed. It was a blue-faced Leicester BFL, 3/4 BFL and 1/4 Romney is what the sheep was that this wool came from. So I carded it up on my drum carder. I've got tons of it, and it was spinning up really fine. So I thought, well, maybe I can just spin a sock's worth, a pair of socks worth of yarn with this, and I can dye it at some point. So I spun up. I thought, well, I spun up 90 grams. Which I thought would be enough for a pair of socks. What happened was the first bobbin, I must have spun a little bit thicker. I spun it earlier this summer because these are the two leftovers. Each bobbin, I had 3 bobbins that each had 30 grams on them, and each of these still have about 9 or 10 grams of singles still left on them. And these are the 2 bobbins that I knit second and third. So I was spinning more finely as I went on than I was at the beginning. So I think if I do another 10 grams, then I can ply these all together, and I'll have another 30 grams worth of yarn. And that should be enough for a pair of socks. So let me roll this out of the way, and then I can show you what the yarn I do have looks like. So this is the yarn. It may be underplied, I don't know, we'll see. This is an experiment, and I want to dye it. I'm soliciting ideas for colors because this is a very light gray, and it has some differences, some darker spots and some lighter spots that will make it really interesting, I think, as a nice tonal yarn. So let me know what color you think I might want to knit these. I'll probably then knit them using a texture pattern because obviously they aren't self-striping, and plain stockinette socks to me are boring if it's a solid color or something close to a solid. So what I have right here is 75 grams of yarn, and I think it's 250 yards. So another 30 grams of yarn will give me about, I don't know, 350, something like that. So I think that will be enough for at least a short pair of socks. I just knit them toe up so I can use up all of the yarn. This is a case where I would want to knit socks toe up. Normally I don't. But if there is a reason, and if I am, don't have tons and tons of yarn, then toe up is the way to go. So let me know what color you think I should go with these. It'll be fun. There's no nylon in this, obviously, so I'll have to reinforce the heels and maybe the balls of feet with some reinforcement yarn. They're not going to be machine washable either, so I'll have to hand wash these. But it'll be a fun experiment. So when I finished this sweater a couple of weeks ago, I realized I really wanted to get a couple of projects on the needles so that I could kind of switch between them instead of just having one to work on, because when I get to the end of one project, I want to be able to just pick up something else, while I'm thinking about what kind of new project. So I thought I'd have 2 things on the needles. And so the first thing is a sweater. When I was deciding whether or not to knit this sweater, I had 3 patterns I was trying to choose from. I like all 3 of them. and I knew I wanted to knit all three. It was just a question of which was going to come first. So this one came first. And so the one that I started just in the past week or two is called Drift. It's by Nora Gahn. It's the feminine version, cardigan version of a sweater that had been in my queue for probably 10 years. It was the men's version, I think it's called Beagle. And I've always loved it. And I was thinking about knitting that one. But you know, the model, he's a big guy, he's got an accent. I'm like, is that just too masculine for me? And let me just look for something else. And then I found Drift, and I'm like, oh, I love it. And then they said, this is the feminine version of Beagle. I'm like, perfect, perfect. It's an interesting knit. It's texture. There's no cables in it. It's just knit purls and a couple of columns of knit through the back loops to make, you know, make some interesting texture as well. And Nora Gahn is a designer at Berroco, and I just really love her designs. I think she's an actual trained designer, and she just always comes up with stuff that I really like. So I was looking forward to this. Unfortunately, when I'm looking at the sizes, they were like 4-inch increments, and I really wanted something that was in between the two of them. So I needed to figure out how to resize that sweater. So I want to go to the overhead and kind of show you how I went through that process. Because otherwise the pattern is perfect. I love it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that I wanted a size that wasn't included in the pattern. So I wanted to kind of show you how I approached that. And it worked for this particular pattern. The approach is going to be similar, like what you have to think about is going to be similar, but how you actually execute making those kinds of modifications can vary from project to project depending on the design and what stitch patterns are being used and all sorts of things. But let's go to the overhead and I'll show you how I made those modifications. So this sweater, because just texture patterns, just knit purl patterns, there's no charts, and I like to chart out my projects ahead of time so I can see where the shaping is and how the stitch patterns lay out. My choices for sizes were 36 inches, and that would be a finished measurement, or 40 inches as a finished measurement. And I wanted something in between there. I thought, you know, 40 is just a little bit bigger than I want, and 36 would give me no ease at all. So I wanted something that was 38. And because of there's all of these patterns, stitch patterns, I wasn't sure how they were laid out from one size to the next. So what I did was I charted out the larger size. I charted out the size 40 to see how everything was laid out. Then I looked at the size 36 and the other side. I looked at the other sizes around there to see what was going on, like where were the additional stitches added or subtracted. And what I saw was that every size in this part right here where there's like ribbing, every size ended the ribbing with purl 2, knit 2, so that there's this column of purl 2s right here. That this is a 38 stitch pattern that every size has, and every size has it twice. And then there's this section of ribbing right here with stockinette in the middle. And as far as I know, that is the same amount. It might go up for the larger sizes. I didn't check that, but for the sizes that were right around what I was looking at, this central part was exactly the same. And so I wanted to see where stitches were added or removed, and mostly it's right here. So the larger the size, more columns of knit 2, purl 2 would be added going out. All of them have the waist shaping done in the same way, where there's 5 decreases going kind of gradually, and then 5 increases that are quicker. So this is meant to hit kind of at the underbust rather than right at the waist. So it's more of an A line from below the underbust, and then it goes up to the total amount you need. So that part was consistent. It was this bit right here, how many stitches for the ribbing, And then I think some of the sizes had a knit two together after the ribbing to reduce this down, and maybe not all of them did. And then as you get up toward the underarm and you're switching the stitch patterns, this stitch pattern has a different gauge than the stitch pattern that's used above the underarms. This double seed stitch pattern right here is used completely for anything above the underarms. So at that transition from the stitch patterns here to the upper bodice stitch pattern, there are some rows of garter stitch. And there are a bunch of decreases that are worked either 7 or 8, depending on what size it is that it's being worked. You'll have 7 decreases across here and then 7 across there. So that was the thing I was looking at was, am I going to need 7 decreases or am I going to need 8? So here's that garter stitch right here where the decreases were done right before it. Then you have the underarm bind offs, and then you have a series of decreases that go for a while. And so that was the other thing I was looking at, is how many underarm bind offs and then how many decreases here in order to get the shoulder width that you need for the size that you want. So those are the kinds of things that I had to work out then, is how many underarm decreases do I want for my size, and then how many decreases would I have as well. And then the final thing to work out would be, how is the shoulder shaping going to be done based on the final shoulder width that I want. I made another decision, which is that for the underarm, or for the armhole depth, I wanted something that was the same as one of the existing sizes, so that I wouldn't have to recalculate the shoulder cap size. Because the way the shoulder cap shaping is done, it creates, a shoulder cap that's a particular length, and it has to fit in the armhole. So I chose one, I don't even remember which size I chose to do the armhole and sleeve size for that one. But as far as the shoulder width, I think I went somewhere in between. All of the sizes have the same neck width, and so it's just a matter of how are you distributing the thirds. So you'll notice that the shoulders have that stair step bind off. I often will use 3-needle bind off to join the shoulders, and in order to do that, you can't bind off a little at a time. You have to bind off all at the same time. You're doing a 3-needle bind off. And so in order to get the shoulder slope, you have to do short rows. The reason that I'm not going to do that, I'm going to keep the stair steps, is because of this stitch pattern. It's a 4-row pattern. If it were a 2-row pattern, then I could easily do short row shaping and maintain the pattern completely. But because it's 4 rows, it's going to interrupt the stitch pattern and kind of make it be disrupted a bit at the top. So instead I will keep these stair step shoulders, and then I will just do an actual seaming, horizontal seams doing this. And I have videos on how you do this. You can do it so it looks pretty good. You'll see the zigzags on the inside of the shoulder, but you really won't see it on the outside. So that part I'm maintaining as well. So I haven't done any blocking on this, so it's all pulled in. This is what the sweater looks like so far. So you can see I've made it up past the garter stitch and the underarms and the decreases, and now I'm just on the straight vertical part of the armholes. But I quite like it. It is a color that I frequently choose in my yarn choices. I go, oh, I like that, and then I realize later this is almost exactly like 3 other sweaters that you already have, so I guess I like this color. The yarn is actually from Berroco. This is a Berroco pattern. It's a free pattern from Berroco by Nora Gahn, and it calls for Berroco Vintage, which is a superwash wool acrylic blend, and I've used it before on sweaters for my kids, and also I think I used it for my 1920s sweater as well. because I could get colors and the right yarn weight that I needed. I didn't want to use vintage for this. I don't like superwash wool or blends for my own sweaters unless there's a real reason to do that. I just wanted wool. And I found that Berroco has just a basic wool yarn. It's like Ella Ray or Cascade 220 or whatever. It's a South American wool blend, and I think this is a 4-ply. Sometimes you get a 3-ply with some of these basic wools, and sometimes a 4-ply. This is a 4-ply. A lot of times these basic yarns are Peruvian Highland wool. This one just says a blend of South American yarns, and what I am noticing is that one of the types of sheep that they're using has got a wool coat with Kemp in it. So let me see if I can zoom in, you can see. So Kemp is a type, it's like a hair, but it's a kind of a coarse, kinky hair that you'll find in some breeds, and it doesn't take dye. So every so often in here, I'll find a piece of this Kemp and I'll pull it out. And I have tried to figure out what breeds they're using where there might be some Kemp in it, but I haven't figured that out yet. They don't say anywhere. One of the things that I thought was interesting about this is that the pattern calls for, it's a worsted weight yarn. So as you would expect, 20 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters, but 26 rows over 4 inches and 10 centimeters. I oftentimes with a standard worsted weight wool will get 28. So 5 stitches and 7 rows per inch is pretty common for me. And so I thought it was interesting that they were expecting something different, and I thought, oh, I might need to adjust the pattern based on row gauge. I did a swatch with it, and I saw that I was getting 26 rows over 4 inches. So I am getting the gauge that they're calling for. Some yarns are just constructed slightly differently, and you might get different row gauges, and that's one of the reasons that you can have trouble with yarn substitutions, is if you're using a yarn that has the same stitch gauge as the yarn that's called for, but your row gauge is different. A lot of times that doesn't matter because you can knit to the right length, but sometimes it does matter. Like if you're knitting a raglan or a yoke sweater, your row gauge is going to be important in order to get the right depth for that bodice. This sweater, it's not as important because you can just knit to length, but I thought that was interesting that I did get the row gauge that they called for, and I did do a gauge swatch because I wanted to see if I actually would get that gauge, because I've never used this yarn before. But like I said, usually with worsted weight wool, I will get 7 rows per inch, but I'm getting 6.5 with this. So that's something to look out for, and that's one of the reasons that your row gauge can be different. It can also be different just from knitter to knitter. Using the same yarn and same stitch gauge, you might just have a different row gauge. So for the sweater, I had exactly the gauge I needed. The yarn was exactly the kind of yarn that is perfectly fine for this project. And the issue was needing to modify it because I wanted a slightly different size. This next project, the sock project, is different. The sizing is all exactly what I want. The problem is with the gauge and the yarn substitution that I needed to make. So I'm knitting a pair of socks from this book. It's probably late 1940s, maybe early 50s. It's an era when men's socks were really interesting. There were a lot of colorwork socks that were not stranded colorwork. They in tarsha, which is color block knitting. It's very different from stranded colorwork, and it requires that you knit the socks flat. Now there are in tarsha in the round techniques, you're still knitting back and forth. You don't ever get out of that with intarsha. But I want to go to the overhead just to give you an idea of what this other project is that I have started. And the mid-century is really interesting for men's socks because there were just so many really cool sock patterns. The one that I am doing is called Diamond Parquet. And it caught my eye months and months ago. Caught my eye when I first saw it. The challenge with this is that it's calling for a 3-ply fingering weight yarn, which is a little thinner than even some of the thinnest regular fingering weight yarn, like a Regia, which is a 4-ply yarn, has like 460 yards or 420 meters and 100 grams. I used to be able to get 9 stitches per inch, but I can only get 8.5 now because my hands don't do the same things that they used to do. But this pattern wants 10 stitches per inch. And so I would need a thinner yarn for that, but I don't know that my hands could handle a needle size that could actually do 10 stitches per inch. And never mind, finding a 3-ply light fingering, but finding one that has enough colors that I could do this. And I also just didn't want to knit an 80-stitch sock, which is what I'd have to do if I had something at 10 stitches per inch. So I needed to modify this, and I'll talk that through maybe in the next Casual Friday, because I think it'll kind of take too long to do that today. But the main trick was picking 4 colors. Color selection is always tricky. I think it's tricky for a lot of people, and it's tricky for me because I do have some color vision deficiencies. But just trying to find things that are the right color value. So I got a bunch of different Regia solid yarns, and then I looked at color combinations I thought might work, and then I took black and white photos of those colors together to see if they would have the same color values as what's in here. That's just what I do. Some people can just instinctively pair different yarns of different colors, and I think it's tricky. Sometimes you can't tell by the color what the color value is. So the colors that I have selected, I've got this light one right here is this yellow. This kind of light one here is this gray. This kind of medium one right here is this kind of magenta-y color that I have right here. And then for the background, I'm using navy. So I'm doing this at 8.5 stitches per inch. I had to adjust the stitch pattern in order to do that. And I will show you how I went about that next time. I just wanted you to know, and some of the other things that I'm doing that maybe are a little different from the pattern, changes I made that I regret. I'll talk about that next time, and I'll just talk about intarsia socks in general, because this is not stranded color work. This is intarsia, so you just have one layer of yarn. You don't have anything stranding across the back. So we'll go over this in the next Casual Friday, but I just wanted to introduce you to this other project that I'm working on. So as I mentioned in the overhead, I will go in more detail about intarsia socks and the challenges of those kinds of socks and the construction methods and how different they are from knitting socks completely in the round. So we'll do that in the next Casual Friday. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.